morning, friends. My name is Terry Godwaldt, and I'm with the Center for Global Education, and I could not be more thrilled to be bringing together schools from coast to coast, from British Columbia to Nova Scotia, representing our prairies, representing Central Canada, representing Quebec, to have a very important dialogue. And it's a dialogue that represents a journey that is that we are in the midst of, and that we will continue to be in the midst of as we build and continue the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as we recognize the fact that we are coming to this as all treaty people, something that we share. Whether we have new Canadians who are here, we have older Canadians who are here, and we'll talk about what these treaties mean to us, where we're at on this journey, and where we need to continue to move as a country. Friends, as I said, my name is Terry Godwaldt, and I'm joining you from Edmonton, Alberta, the Queen Elizabeth High School. And I want to acknowledge that I am on Treaty 6 territory, traditional meeting place and grounds and gathering grounds and traveling route for the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Blackfoot, the Dene, the Dakota Sioux, the Métis, and we acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis and Inuit people whose footsteps mark these lands for centuries. Friends, it's interesting that we're all gathering here to continue conversations using a new medium. We're gathering in places where physically people have gathered for thousands of years to share ideas, where people in my community of Edmonton, we've gathered for thousands of years to enter into dialogue and to exchange customs and engage in trade. And now we're continuing this through a different medium, but it's the same dialogues that we're continuing. And it's so very important for us to have this. And friends, for us to be able to do this in partnership with young people, the future of this country, in partnership with our Senate, who at its very basis is set to represent voices, to make sure that every voice is heard, not just the most powerful or the one that has the largest majority, but to make sure that all of our country's voices are heard and are able to be represented. And in particular, we have three senators, Senator Pat Duncan, Senator Kim Pate, Senator Marty Klyne, who are going to be sharing their journeys, where they're at, and will be introducing themselves shortly in order to do exactly that. So I will pass it over to them in a second. But what we will do before we meet them is we will meet our friends who are joining us from coast to coast. So we're going to start on the East Coast, and with our friends in Nova Scotia. We are missing two schools: our friends in Quebec and our friends in New Brunswick. Maybe Rebecca, you can just write me a note if they happen to join, and we'll be able to bring them in as we go. But let's pass it over to our friends at Northeast Kings. Over to you. And each of the schools is going to do a treaty acknowledgement of the land that they're on. And so Northeast Kings, if you're able to make your way to the microphone, we're ready for you now. All right, so we're not hearing you. So we're going to continue to make our way west. We'll come back to you, Northeast Kings, don't worry. We're going to connect now with our friends at BSS. Go ahead. All right. Now, Rebecca, are you able to confirm the volume coming through? Can you just give me a hello from your side?
Hi.
There we go. We're ready for you. Go ahead.
Together we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, on whose ancient and sacred land we live, work, and play. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic injustices that stem directly from past wrongdoings, and we commit ourselves indefinitely to respecting and reconciling this long history of injustice.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much. Thank you for joining us. To our friends at Northeast Kings, you're able to... Oh, there we go. We have you. Okay, go ahead.
Good. Hi, thanks, Terry. Sorry about that. Just, of course, a slight technical glitch. I should have the teenagers trying to figure this out rather than myself. I'm going to pass this over to one of my students, Michaela, for the land acknowledgement.
Our Northeast Kings, we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which is Maliseet and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what has been an ongoing relationship between nations.
Brilliant. Well done and well said. Thank you so much. Great job. Okay, let's go across now to our friends at Cold Lake. Go ahead, Cold Lake. There we go. We got you. Good job.
Cold Lake High School acknowledges.
So Cold Lake, I have a feeling you might have a second computer that's going, or you might have some speakers that are kind of feeding back into the microphone. Let's try that one more time, and then we'll go from there. Go ahead. Oh, you're muted now. Sorry, Cold Lake, you're muted. There we go. Good job, you're doing it.
Cold Lake High School acknowledges Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, as well as the Métis. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose footsteps has marked the lands for generations, including the many places that you are joining from. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territories we reside on or are visiting.
Brilliant. Well done, Cold Lake. Good job. That was excellent. Thank you for doing that. Okay, now we have our friends at Queenie. Queenie, you're going to come right up beside me. Please do come right up. I'm going to squeeze over here and let you go ahead. Does anybody want to take a picture for doing it as well? Do you want a picture? Okay, good. Here we go.
We wish to acknowledge that the land which we gather on is Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds and home for many Indigenous people, including the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, and Nakota Sioux people.
Brilliant. Well done. Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. Oh, we're going to give everybody a round of applause because, friends, I'll tell you, that takes a lot of courage to stand in front of a camera and introduce yourself to the entire country, and you should all be proud of yourselves. So let's continue. Oh, we're not done yet. We are continuing west. Thank you, Rebecca, though, because I do forget a lot of things. And so it was very, very good. So now let's hop across with a little bit of water in between and the Rockies to our friends at Westshore. Go ahead, Westshore.
We at Westshore Center for Learning are joining you from the traditional Coast Salish Nation territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nation in Colwood, British Columbia. Hechka. And talked.
Excellent. Good job. Well done. What I'm going to ask, actually, friends, if someone can walk across to that computer because it's on a separate computer and just press OK, and then you can just say got it, and then that's good to go. Does that make sense? Yep. Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay, so now is that everybody, Rebecca? Is anybody else here that we need to acknowledge? Brilliant. Okay. We did. They did a great job. Yeah. Excellent. All right, friends. So as I shared, today is not a new conversation. Today is a conversation that Canadians have been embarking on in a really conscientious way since the incredible work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But this is a journey that we will continue on as a nation for as many nations for generations to come. And as I said before, for us to be able to engage in this conversation as young people from across the country with our Canadian senators and representing so much of the country in the regions that they are there to represent, I think is an honor, and I think is work that we need to continue to do. And we're so proud and honored to work with Cengage and the great work that they're doing to engage young people in the work of our Canadian Senate. So I'm going to pass the microphone over first to Senator Pate is going to go first to tell us about what it means for all of us to be treaty people and to move forward as a country in that regard. Senator Pate, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for joining. It's wonderful to see people from all across the country and to see my colleagues. And I join you on from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I'm on the shores of the Kitchissippi, otherwise known to many on Turtle Island as Ottawa, Ontario, and it's where I live, work, and play. And I have the privilege and responsibility of also being a senator in this territory. So when I was very happy to see what you were asking us to talk about, because we are all treaty people. And as you mentioned, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission really reinforced that. But so did the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples decades before. And so has the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry. And so from my perspective, I suspect I have presented with Senator Klyne before, and I suspect he will do a very good historical run through. Just by judging from the materials that you sent out, it's clear that all of you students have done it. So I thought I'd jump into the area where I have worked most and why in the Senate I see some of the work we can do on reconciliation as treaty people, and recognizing treaty is vitally important. So we know that Canada as Canada formed as a country, we undid much of the treaty work that had already been done and then have violated many of the treaties that were signed with First Nations since then, and didn't understand treaty as not just a piece of paper, but treaty as ceremony, treaty as relationship, treaty as process, treaty as law. And so when the Indian Act was brought in after Canada became a country, it almost immediately undid much of what, particularly the 1763 proclamation had brought in, which the 1763 proclamation is often described as essentially like the Magna Carta was to common law. The Royal Proclamation was to the relationship between First Nations and invaders or settlers who were coming to the country. And the recognition was supposed to be that we were going to journey together, keeping our own traditions, but working together to develop the country, the people, the relationships that would be harmonious and self-preserving, but also encouraging growth for all peoples. Well, we quickly didn't do that. When the Indian Act was proclaimed in 1985, it suddenly did things like outlaw many of the ceremonies and practices and laws of Indigenous peoples. It created permits and reserve systems. And so an area that I've worked in for many, many years is the whole area of people who are marginalized, victimized, criminalized, and institutionalized, particularly in prisons. And there you see the very first prisons for Indigenous people in this country were reserves. They were required to have passes to go off them. It was illegal for them to go off the reserve. So essentially they were imprisoned on reserves. Once that pass system was expunged, then we started to see people actually being criminalized, not just for practicing ceremonies, which they were, but also for all kinds of other issues. And so we saw some of the first women jailed at the prison for women in Kingston, for instance. Indigenous women were jailed for failing to get medical attention when they had their children, not because anything happened to their children, but because it was the only way to criminalize them for trying to protect their children and keep them from being taken by the Indian agent, by the RCMP, by religious orders to residential schools. Fast forward, we see the trajectory into the child welfare system. We see the separation, the long-standing impact of separating children and communities from ceremony and their traditional structures. And as I'm sitting here talking to you today, Indigenous people are the fastest growing prison population, especially women, and they are approaching now 1 in 2 in federal custody. So what does it mean to me to work in a treaty relationship? It means that we have to undo the wrongs, the historical discriminatory treatment in everything from child welfare to the criminal legal system to the corrections system. But to do that, we have to breathe life into not just the TRC and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but our own Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which says we should not have that kind of equality, and means we have to look at economic equality, gender equality, racial equality, and we have to engage in some of the efforts to ensure that we return land, or that we have land governance models that don't just recognize municipalities, provinces, and federal governments, but actually recognize the nation-to-nation relationship that treaties demand with First Nations. And so I am very excited about looking forward as to how we can do this and breathe life into those provisions and really become the treaty, all treaty people that the proclamation in 1763 promised. So I look forward to the comments of my colleagues. I very much look forward to the questions and to the dialogue. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so very much, Senator Pate. And seeing this as active, living, breathing documents that require work. And I think is something that we're going to see the young people bringing forward and really calling us all to account in the work that needs to be done. Thank you for sharing that. And now we're going to pass the microphone to Senator Duncan to continue to share and shed light on the fact that we are all treaty people. Senator Duncan, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I'm grateful to be speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Kwanlundun First Nation and the Tonquachin Council in the Yukon. My lived experience in the Yukon is different from elsewhere in Canada. In my lifetime, as a Yukoner, as a Canadian, we have become treaty people. You might be familiar with your Canadian history and the gold rush in the Yukon in 1896 when gold was discovered. At that point in time, some 60,000 people, white men and women, came into the Yukon. There were about 3,000 Yukon, and I'm going to use the term Indian people because that's the term that's used in a document that I'll explain later. At that time, although there are some estimates that there were more than that. That was in 1896, 1897, 1898, the gold rush. In 1902, Chief Jim Boss of the Tonquachin petitioned the Commissioner of the Yukon for a reserve. An offer of land was made, but there was no treaty ever signed. No reserves have ever been created in the Yukon. There are lands set aside, but there were no reserves. In 1973, Elijah Smith and several Yukon First Nation leaders, including Sam Johnson, who later became the Speaker of the Yukon Legislative Assembly, and Judy Gingell, who later became Commissioner of the Yukon. Commissioner is the equivalent of the Lieutenant Governor in the provinces. These First Nation leaders presented a document entitled Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow to then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. It was, in the words of Elijah Smith, it was the first time that a group of Canadian people of Native ancestry had prepared and presented such a document based on principles that all the Indians of the Yukon had the right to develop their lives fully in a society where their cultural and social wishes and needs were capable of being met. The document outlines Aboriginal rights, defines what it means to be an Indian, and claims the traditional homeland. The Prime Minister accepted the document, and the process of negotiating land claims began. 20 years later, in 1993, an umbrella final agreement was signed by Canada, the Yukon, and the Council of Yukon Indians, now referred to as the Council of Yukon First Nations. And you'll recall the name that I mentioned a few moments ago, Sam Johnson. His son, Peter Johnson, is the Grand Chief of the Council of Yukon First Nations. Under the umbrella final agreement, this major document, 11 of 14 Yukon First Nations have now completed their negotiations and have signed final land claim agreements. These final agreements qualify as treaties under Section 35(1) of the Canadian Constitution. So that is how we have become truly treaty people. And it's this process of negotiating land claims and giving life and meaning to the implementation of those land claim agreements. And I'm just delighted at the opportunity to speak with you and to share with you how these agreements are working in the Yukon today, how the Yukon government, the elected Yukon government, has government to government relationships with Yukon First Nations. There are 3 Yukon First Nations who have not yet completed their land claim negotiation and their land settlement agreements. It's a work in progress, which I hope in my lifetime we will truly see more progress. I just would like to, before we move on to Senator Klyne and a discussion of and answering your questions, I'd just like to share with you, not that anyone wants additional reading, but some excellent documents that you may find of interest are, of course, the Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow document that was presented. It's available through the Council of Yukon First Nations. And I'd also highly recommend to you and to your schools the Institute for Research in Public Policy. There are 2 documents that have been produced by and written by Gabrielle A. Slowey. They are Indigenous Self-Government in the Yukon, Looking for Ways to Pass the Torch. And she outlines in that document a forum that was held to enable young First Nations people to learn the ways of negotiating and learning the history of the land claim negotiation. And she has also recently written about the development of a Yukon First Nations school board in the Yukon. So looking forward to your questions and happy to chat with you and to thank you again for this opportunity. And I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Senator Marty Klyne.
Senator Duncan, thank you so much for sharing and thank you for shedding that light, the fact that we are all on this journey together, but each of the regions has a different story to tell. And each of the regions has, this isn't one mono group of Canadians, of Indigenous people. This is nation to nations. These are people to people. These are friends to friends, and it's one that requires the getting to know our neighbors and engaging in the reality that is our journey in our place where we live. Thank you for sharing that. So we're going to pass the microphone now to Senator a little bit closer to my stomping grounds here in Treaty 6. But Senator Klyne, would you be willing to share? And then friends, after this, just so everyone's ready, we're going to go back to our friends in Nova Scotia. And Nova Scotia has prepared some questions, some thoughts that they would like to share. Feel free to address a particular senator, or if you would like me to decide, we can open it up, and but we will go east to west because as you can see, we have quite a few people on the call. So before we get to those questions and statements, Senator Klyne, would you be so kind as to share?
Would be my pleasure. Hello. I'm speaking from Regina, Saskatchewan, which is on Treaty 4 territory and homeland of the Métis Nation. I was raised as a Cree Métis, and I am a member of Little Black Bears Band, a Cree and Assiniboine First Nation in southern Saskatchewan. Thank you for your interest in treaties. Kelowna Accord is something else I want to speak to, but also just going to back up for a second. Senator Pate had mentioned the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and I would absolutely, much like Senator Duncan, make that a reading requirement. not so much a requirement because I'm not the teacher, but I would make it a recommendation that you do look at the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Similarly, I would suggest that you look at the Kelowna Accord, which was a series of agreements between the Government of Canada, First Nations of the and First Ministers of the provinces, territorial leaders, and the leaders of the 5 national Aboriginal organizations in Canada. This Kelowna Accord sought to improve education, employment, and living conditions for Aboriginal peoples through governmental funding and other programs. The Accord was endorsed by Prime Minister Paul Martin and came oh so close to being part of this country, but was never endorsed by a successor. So I'll carry on, but I do suggest you look at the Kelowna Accord and the realm of possibilities that it laid out. I'll focus on the 3 points. 1, the history of why we're all treaty people in Canada, how treaties have been violated or misunderstood over the years, and how we can all uphold treaties today to further reconciliation and become an inclusive, more productive, and stronger country. Treaties, and I just want to start out by saying that Senator Pate and Senator Duncan did a great job and a nice foundation to build on. So I'm going to give you kind of an overview. Treaties are formal, legally binding agreements, generally between independent countries, much like the free trade agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico. A treaty like a contract, it is like a contract. It is a contract. If you sell something, you have the right to the money because both parties agreed to a deal. A court can enforce contracts as well as treaties within its jurisdiction, as the Supreme Court does with Indigenous treaties. You can think of Canada's Constitution as another contract that the provinces agreed to in 1867, with some joining later. The deal, the 1987 Constitutions Act, made Canada a country. I just want to make sure that I'm still on the air here, so thank you.
We got you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. The Constitution also includes Indigenous treaties. These are agreements that all Canadians are part of in our democracy, with a duty as citizens to uphold it. Indigenous treaties can exchange rights to some lands or resources like fisheries for cooperation on education, healthcare, defense, and other subjects. We should remember that all Canadians have benefited from treaties through land access, access to resources, and opportunities for wealth creation. All Canadians need to keep up their end of the bargain. When the British colonized Canada after winning a war with France, they accepted that the land belonged to Indigenous peoples through the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This meant treaties were legally required to settle land. Indigenous partners' rights to land and resources are called inherent rights. This means our rights come from our situations, identities, and ties to places in Canada from time immemorial. Inherent rights have recognized in the Constitution since 1982 and in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples since 2007, which is now law in Canada. Inherent rights can be altered by treaties. There are 95 treaties in Canada. Started in the 1870s, Canada and Indigenous nations signed the famous 11 number treaties, which stretch from Ontario to parts of BC. At the time, Canada wanted to build a railway to the Pacific. Not to mention many Indigenous nations were at the time suffering due to the slaughter of the buffalo and foreign diseases that Europeans brought with them. Indigenous nations agreed to some of the treaties while under that duress. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission also notes there was no evidence that negotiators described the government's planned policy of assimilation. There are also many modern treaties, and as I referenced earlier, much of BC is not covered by treaties. So to talk about treaty violations for a moment, it is common thinking among many Indigenous peoples that if the treaties had been simply upheld, their situation would be much better. Nevertheless, Indigenous treaties were violated throughout Canadian history by federal and provincial governments, as were inherent rights of people without treaties. Violations often came in the form of racist policies of forced assimilation, such as the Indian Act, which attacked self-government at every turn and created the residential school system. Lands and resources were wrongfully taken from Indigenous peoples, such as in BC, where settlement occurred and timber was cut without treaties. Public services and other treaty obligations to Indigenous peoples are sometimes unjustly and rudely misconstrued as handouts rather than reciprocal obligations to hold up an end of a deal. Upholding treaties. Going forward, we have a chance to do better. Making things right is reconciliation. This starts with education. People who have not had the opportunity to learn about treaties cannot be blamed for not doing their part to keep them. The past does not need to equal the future. Generational change is afoot. For new Canadians, the new citizenship oath now reflects the importance of treaties. It's also important for Canadians to commemorate the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation every September 30, so everyone can learn and take part. Education is why teachers and students are the future of reconciliation. As students, you can now educate your family and friends, so you are also the teachers. In closing, thank you for your interest today and for doing your part to advance reconciliation in our great country, where our future can be even brighter. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Senator Klyne. Friends, it's interesting, Senator, you know, we so often think about treaties just as something that happens in Canada, but we have an American border that's based on a treaty, and no one would ever think of violating that. But other people's positions on other treaties, we want, there may be groups that may question, but that importance of realizing these are legal documents, and just as we expect them to be held internationally, so too should they be held nationally. But at the same time, this is a journey that we're on together, that this new generation is taking up, I think, in earnest, and so there is so very much hope for that. Senators, thank you all for sharing and for kind of laying the groundwork for the discussion that we're going to have. Now, our friends at the schools from coast to coast have been looking into, in particular, the call to action from the TRC, and they would like to share some of their thoughts, share some of the questions that they have, and we're going to start with our friends in the east and then make our way west. So Northeast Kings, we're going to let you come and make your way to the microphone. And so just to clarify, teachers, if you go on the chat, you'll see that Rebecca has posted the order in terms of the order that the schools will go in. And so Northeast Kings, come on up. And in the next 25 minutes, we will take your points as you address the 70 calls to action from the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Northeast Kings.
Thanks, Terry. You can hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay, I'm going to pass the mic over to one of my students here. I have Brielle and Elijah here. And just an FYI, the class ends for us, we're on a different schedule, in about 7 minutes. So some of the students may no longer be available at that point. So just a heads up for you. I'm going to pass it over to Brielle first.
Great job. Thanks, Brielle. Thanks for the courage to come on up and say what you want to say. It takes a lot of guts. Brielle, go ahead.
For the call to action 24, they call upon many medical and nursing schools to let students notice and require them to take a course that teaches them Aboriginal health issues, including the history and legacy of residential schools. And the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Treaties and Aboriginal Rights, and Indigenous Teachings and Practices. But are there a lot of non-Aboriginal individuals that do not want to partake in any of these required courses or changes in society? If so, how do you guys take care of the issue?
All right. So your question is that the fact that there is this call to participation in training courses, but there may all groups may not be looking to participate in them, and are you asking specifically about Indigenous groups that are not looking to participate, or a more general piece?
More just non-Aboriginal individuals not partaking in these courses.
Thank you. So the non-Aboriginal groups that are not looking to participate. Do you have a senator in particular you'd like to address that to? Otherwise, maybe we'll, if one of the senators would like to maybe write a note that they would be willing to take it in the chat window. Otherwise, we'll just go in the order that we had the introductions. Senator Duncan, maybe we'll pass that to you.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be able to address this question on two fronts. First of all, I can share that a patient, an individual who presents at the emergency ward at Whitehorse General Hospital, the major hospital in the Yukon, is asked if they wish to identify as First Nation, Inuit, or Métis. If so, we have First Nations health programming that's available to them, including traditional foods. All hires, employees hired at the hospitals in the Yukon, there are 3, must take Yukon First Nations 101 through the University of Yukon. And in terms of, that's the Yukon response. So we have implemented and I believe are giving life and meaning to that particular call to action, and have done or are doing, and we have prior to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And in terms of Canada's response, I sit on the National Finance Committee, and we have just recently examined the government's supplementary estimates, and there are millions of dollars that are dedicated to hospitals, to health, elimination of racism in First Nations, in the delivery of healthcare. So that is transfer payments or money that will be made available for the elimination of racism in medical treatment in Canada. So there is a dedicated funding to address this very issue.
And thank you, Northeast Kings, for that great question, and really talking about the importance of education there, right? This is something that doesn't just happen, but as a country, we need to make conscientious steps and put those practices in place. Now, Elijah, did you have a follow-up question you want to ask? Unless it's related, Elijah, what we'll do is we'll let everybody ask one, and then we'll come back to you afterwards. Is that all right? I think you might be muted there, Elijah.
Mr. Godwaldt, I'll remind you they only have 7 minutes. So
yes. Yeah, we have 2 minutes. I didn't hear what you said. Sorry.
Okay, we'll just say we're going to come back to you. We're going to come back to you afterwards, and then so you can ask a second question then. Okay. So let's go on, and thank you, Senator Klyne. Let's go on now to our friends at BSS. Go ahead. Do you have a question?
Hi, these questions are related to child welfare and calls to action 1 to 5. In 2005, Jordan River Anderson of Norway House Creek Nation died at just 5 years old while the government argued over who would pay for the medical treatment he required. Jordan's principle was then created to protect Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit youth. It requires the government to provide any funding for healthcare, social, and educational services for First Nations children. The application process is administratively challenging. This leads us to wonder, how does the Canadian government hope to expedite all applications of Jordan's principle and to give the power to choose if a need must be met to Indigenous youth themselves, instead of to the government's outdated understanding of what Indigenous identity looks like? And what is something the Canadian government can do to make sure that more in-depth training goes into fostering an Indigenous child, as well as what laws can be implemented to place Indigenous children with families who share and know how to?
All right. Senator Klyne. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say any senators who would like to speak. I'd be really open to hearing.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for clarifying whether it was a directed question or an open question.
Sure. I'll take
maybe we'll pass this. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to give you an overview very quickly on child welfare, which I think will give you some sense of direction on that. In 2019, the government passed Bill C-92 to restore Indigenous jurisdictions over child and family services, answering the TRC call to action number 4. This means that the Indigenous nations will be able to prevent the assimilation of Indigenous children and provide culturally appropriate upbringings. The government's also made efforts to uphold, as you referenced, Jordan's principle, meaning that First Nations children living on and off reserve must have equal access to government services. And just on that note, 60 to 70% of First Nations citizens live in urban off-reserve communities. The government recently reached a $40 billion settlement agreement to reform Indigenous child welfare and compensate for its discrimination in the past. But I'd also like to, I would like to see the provinces embrace C-92 rather than fighting it in the court, which the Quebec government has done, unfortunately. And it's not uncommon that the provinces and territories, provinces mainly, regard First Nations issues and Métis issues as federal jurisdiction. So it's kind of like they can wipe their hands from it. I'd also like to see the government finally end boil water advisories. No Canadian child should have to live like that in such a rich country. And I'd also like to really see the housing crisis agenda get advanced as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And great question, BSS. Okay. All right. Next on the list, let's go to our friends at Cold Lake, and then Queenie, you're next. Cold Lake, go ahead.
Okay, hi, I'm Drugprisha Jambier, and we've been learning a lot about intergenerational trauma. So I was wondering what's been done to stop that from cycling through like the generations.
You know what? I think I did hear the word intergenerational trauma, and I think this is so incredibly important. Could you say this one more time, but maybe take a step a little bit closer to the microphone? We don't want to miss anything that you have to say.
What's been done to stop the intergenerational trauma, to stop it from cycling through like generations of Aboriginals?
Such a great question. What is being done to help stop the intergenerational trauma as this continues to cycle through to the many young people? Do we have a senator who'd like to speak to that?
I have some references, okay, but I think that I'd like to hear from Senator Pate, and then if there's time, I'd like to follow that up.
Well, why don't you start, Senator Klyne? That's fine. I'm happy to add on.
Okay, I'll try to be quick here. But, I think I have to reference having had the privilege of sitting in on a committee meeting where there was 20-some youth, mostly teenagers, that came in to speak to a group of senators. And they spoke to, actually one of the leaders stepped forward after we heard from all these wonderful young students, young adults. And I was just so pleased to hear their vision of their future and where they want to go. And one of the leaders stood up and spoke, and said, these youth have made it very clear to us that they see their opportunity lies in education. They look around their communities, they see drugs, they see gangs, and they see that intergenerational abuse. And they see the way out from all of that through education. And if there is some time, I could talk about education from reconciliation, but I want to turn it back to Senator Pate.
Thank you very much for that, Senator Klyne, and I agree. I think one of the things we often look at is what do we do right now to try and redress what happened before, and yet we see great strides made, as both of my colleagues have talked about, but we also see incredible resistance. Many of you, especially young people who have joined in the calls, for instance, and support for Cindy Blackstock's work in the First Nation Caring Society to actually really interfere with and remedy the wrongs of the past. And I think we need to look at in every sphere all of the things that have already been talked about. And I was really excited to see, I think it was Monday of this week, BC announced that every young person before they can graduate high school has to have engaged in some education around First Nations issues and governance and treaty issues. That is a huge step forward because, as I was reminded last night at a session I was about journalism unrelated to this, but the fact that we have abandoned and cut so many services in so many ways means that those who are most challenged, whether it's Indigenous people, other racialized people, have been left behind. And then we expect people to literally pull themselves up by their bootstraps when many of them don't even have boots. And so we need to really undo those wrongs of the past. And some of, I think the treaty relationship, gives us a perfect way to move forward, because in all of the calls to action of the TRC and all of the calls for justice of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, they go back to the basics of making sure every child has what they need, making sure that we have housing, clean water, and supports in place. And if I could say, one of the areas that the federal government, in my humble opinion, is still lacking, despite all of what my colleagues have talked about, is really putting our money where our mouth is sometimes. That there are some resources available, absolutely. But part of the resistance to things like the child welfare bill or the language bill is the government said provinces and territories and First Nations can do this, but they didn't provide the resources. And that was part of the treaty relationship. It was in exchange for the use of lands that we were supposed to be sharing in those resources. So I think there's a long way to go, but we're on the right path.
Great, thank you so very much, Senators. Now I'm joined by a young lady here. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Nura. Okay, how will you act on the recommendations from the inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? What does the Senate plan on doing about the situation?
Great question. Okay, I think Senator Pate wanted to share. I'm not 100% sure, but maybe Senator, do you want to address that?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, I mean, just before this session, I was having a meeting with one of my colleagues, a First Nations woman from Treaty 1 territory, Member of Parliament Leah Gazan, about one of the calls for justice, which is to implement a guaranteed livable income. And through the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, being renamed the Indigenous Peoples Committee, which is also a great move forward. We plan to look at, with Senator Michelle Odette, who was one of the commissioners for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, the action plan that we need to engage in to implement those calls for justice. So I'm very excited about that. Thank you very much for asking the question. Thanks to all of you for your incredible work. And I will now make some room for my colleagues.
Yes, and I do believe that Senator, if you want to stay, Senator Duncan is also going to address this. Senator Duncan?
Thank you so much, and thank you for that excellent question. I would just like to share that the Yukon was the first, even ahead of Canada, to the Government of Canada, to address the missing and murdered women and Indigenous girls, Two-Spirited People inquiry with an action plan. And that action plan was unveiled in November 2020, I believe it was. And we gathered together as a community and signed on. And I was invited and our pledge was to implement the action plan articulated by the Yukon, and including the call for, as Senator Pate has noted, the guaranteed livable income. There's another document called Putting People First that examines the Yukon healthcare, that says we need to put this pilot project in place. The important point to all of that is that all of the Yukon leaders, so every member of every party in the Yukon Legislative Assembly, the RCMP, the chiefs, the mayors, the member of parliament, the senator, we all signed a document that pledged our commitment to the Yukon strategy. So I think, what is the Senate doing? That's what I, as the Yukon senator, have done, is committed publicly to the strategy developed by Yukoners to implement the recommendations. This pin that you see that I'm wearing was given to each person, each representative who signed on. And although we're not technically supposed to wear more than one pin in the chamber, I do wear this proudly and as a reminder of my commitment to implement that strategy. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. And it reminds me, I mean, what about other provinces? So we know that the territory of Yukon has signed this commitment of action. I wonder where the other provinces are at. And then as young people, right? I mean, you live in a democracy, and friends, you live in a community. And so many of you are almost 18, but so you have the opportunity to engage democratically, and governments will respond to that. But even just as importantly is you engaging in your schools. Does your school have a strategy? Does the community that you live in have a strategy for addressing these calls of action, to addressing the TRC, to addressing the missing and murdered Aboriginal report? And so let's look to our governments, but then let's also look to ourselves in this dialogue as well. So last of our regions to come across to, and is our friends on Vancouver Island. So Westshore, would you like to have our last question? And then friends, we're almost at the top of the hour and running short on time. So we won't have time to cycle through everybody again, but we will have an opportunity to engage further after. So Vancouver Island, Westshore Center, over to you.
All right, this question is going to be directed towards Senator Klyne. I would like to know why up to 73% of reservations don't have clean drinking water, and what are the steps being made to further that?
There is some great effort being made in the last few years to get to these communities and get them off boil water advisories and get them some clean drinking water. Making no excuses for anybody, but COVID did complicate that process. There was some momentum. The momentum will pick up again, and there is some commitments to make sure that the government gets all of those communities addressed. And that is a crisis, and it is an issue. And as I said earlier, no child, no family, no senior should have to endure anything but clean, potable drinking waters. And there's still, as somebody just said, I think it was Senator Pate said, there's a lot of work to do and a long road to travel here yet, but nobody's going to give up on this. And there's a lot of commitment at the federal level, and certainly with the members of parliament in the House of Commons and in the Senate. Senator Pate, I think, had something.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I absolutely agree, Senator Klyne. And thank you for raising this really important issue, because these are policy decisions. And as you just reminded us, Terry, the reality is all of you are leaders, and you will, some of us are getting pretty long in the tooth and old here. And, but you're leading us forward, and you're going to be if you're not already voting. And if Senator McFedrin's bill gets through when you're 16, you might be able to vote. But these are policy decisions, and you, through yourselves as well as through your parents and the other adults in your lives, can influence that. Because if we can get, as way smarter people than me have said, if we can get water and internet on the space station, Why can't we get it in every community? And in countries like Finland, where oil was quote unquote discovered or exploited, depending on your perspective, at about the same time as oil was found in Alberta, a very different decision was made, policy decision was made by the Finnish government. And it was about the same geographic size, same population size. But what they said was this will be a national resource and all of the resources will go into benefiting everybody. So I'm told you can go to the most remote fjord in Finland and still have drinkable water, housing, education, internet. You can't say the same even in Alberta, even though it's one of the wealthiest provinces. And so these are policy decisions, and you have huge potential to keep our feet to the fire, but also keep elected officials' feet to the fire to make the right policy decisions. So I think it's really exciting that you're studying this, that you're working on this, and that you've engaged with us on this. So thank you very much.
Senator Pate, that leads us right here to the end, but I want to continue this challenge that you have sent to all the young people as they have challenged you and the government today. So I'd like to give Senator Duncan and Senator Klyne an opportunity as well to address the young people in a general sense around the next steps they need to take as treaty people themselves. Right? You are a treaty person, right? You, each of us individually, sometimes we have big language. We are all treaty people. No, I am a treaty person. Me, my little sister, my little brother, my family, right? Senator Klyne, we'll go to you first, and then Senator Pate Senator Duncan will end with you. But Senator Klyne, what challenge, what word would you have imparting to the young people today?
Well, one of my colleagues mentioned earlier that around education is important in this regards of reconciliation and understanding the truth, which lies in the history of things, and get an understanding of those things. But one thing is, you should try to figure this out for yourself. Why do we need to do this? And maybe the answer to that question is, what happens if we don't do this? And I think we're missing a lot of opportunity, a lot of productivity, plus an obligation to fulfill treaties. We have to hold up the end of that deal. Everybody needs to hold up the end of that deal. And Canada can be a much better, stronger, more productive, and sound, inclusive economy and country. And I think that we're missing opportunities there. But as I said earlier, generational change is afoot, and we're speaking to that generational change today. You can lead the way, you can lead the future. And, I think that in many ways we've set the stage for you to do just that.
Amen. All right. Senator Duncan, do you have any parting words for the young people across Canada?
I do. First of all, I want to say thank you. I truly, as a senator, appreciate this opportunity for you to ask questions and to engage in a dialogue, to listen and to hear from one another. I really am grateful for this opportunity. Thank you. And I also want to express my thanks for your attention and for your efforts to not only to learn about the treaties in Canada, but to give life and meaning to them. It's one thing to read the words on paper and to appreciate the advice from our elders and those who have gone before. It's another to truly understand and appreciate what the words in the treaty mean, and to give life and meaning to them, to understand that the offering of First Nation languages in your school classes and in education is part of truly living the treaties that have been negotiated, that have been put in place by those who have gone before us. And I would echo Senator Pate and Senator Klyne's and Mr. Godwaldt's encouragement to become involved, to be part of the process, to share your knowledge, and to work together as Canadians to truly bring truth and reconciliation to to Canada and to all Canadians. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Senator, so much for sharing. I want to say a huge thank you to our friends at Cengage who are playing this important role of facilitating these type of dialogues and helping Canadians to understand the important role that the Canadian Senate has. Now, I do believe that we would like to take a group selfie. Or just a group shot. So if you everybody get yourselves all beautified. I am going to, how are we going to do this on our side? I'm going to turn, because my camera is only on me and I am far less important than the young people who are in the room with me. So if we're going to turn the microphone and we're going to do a countdown. I'm going to go 3, 2, 1. Everybody pose. And then, yeah, that's it. Come on in. Come on in. That's it. We're moving. We got chairs with rollers here that are being turned around. Okay, so ready and screenshot people. Are you ready? Here we go. 3, 2, 1, go! Woo! Okay. We'll send that all to you later, and we'll go from there. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all for the amazing work you have done in preparation. There was a note that was there. Those postcards are still available. So the Senate has invited and encouraged you all to continue to ask your questions, to continue to challenge and engage in dialogue through those postcards that we have. So please do send those off so that those can be replied to and taken to the Senate. Everyone, have yourselves a wonderful day. Thank you for your time. Thank you, senators. We very much appreciate you.
Thank you all. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Duncan. Thank you, Senator Klyne. Thank you, Senator Pate.
Thank you, and sorry for my informality of calling you by your first name earlier. My apologies for that.
No, please do. Please do.
Okay, take good care, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Great to see you, Pat.